Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to go through the build of the 1/48 scale Hobbycraft BearCat. Now this video originally, my plan was to do it as a test mule for vallejometacolors. I wanted to see what could be accomplished using vallejometacolors. However, it became a long format scale model build. So I really hope you enjoy the long format and the detail that I went into on my painting process for the cockpit and how to make everything look nice out of box. I began by first applying a coat of Vallejo Gloss Black Primer. The primer was sprayed directly onto the engine piece at 18 psi using a 0.4mm needle nozzle straight from the bottle. Once the primer was applied, I airbrushed a coat of vallejometalcolor gunmetal on top. On camera, it is really hard to tell the gunmetal apart from the primer as they are both very dark colors. However, the gunmetal has a very nice shiny metallic look to it in real life. Once the gunmetal was dry, I dry brushed vallejometalcolor aluminum on top of the raised engine surfaces. This does two things. It creates that shiny metallic look that radio engines have, and it also creates depth with shadows in the recessed areas. I further enhanced this effect by applying a black wash. However, I forgot to record that portion. The engine head was also primed in gloss black primer. In order to create a more used look, I applied some pre-shading using white. You don't have to be precise with this, you just want to give it some shadows. Once finished, I airbrushed the engine head using neutral gray. The various components of the engine were painted using a 00 brush and a wet palette. If you plan to do any sort of brush painting, I highly recommend purchasing a wet palette. It will permanently change your brush game, and it's just really helpful overall. After the headpiece was painted, I applied Alcalad Aqua Gloss to protect the paintwork from an oil wash. Let the Aqua Gloss set for 1 hour prior to applying any wash or decals on top. For the wash, I'm using Tamiya Brown Panel Liner. Brown is a good color to use with engines as it resembles engine grease and sludge. The wash is pretty straightforward. Apply it on. You don't need to be super precise as you can clean the excess later. The aqua gloss will protect the paint and you don't need to worry about the panel liner damaging your paint job. Once the wash was dry, I came back in with odorless thinners to wipe away the excess, leaving the wash only in the corners, recessed areas, and panel lines. Once the wash is settled in and I'm happy with the look, it is time for the flat coat. Once the flat coat is applied, I will add in my last round of weathering. For my last round of weathering, I'm going to do some chipping. I'm using AK Interactive Weathered Pencil Dirty White. AK pencils can be applied wet or dry. I find that most of the pencils really work only if you applied wet, but the Dirty White works well when applied dry. I'm using the pencil to create scratches and some paint fading to give more life to this engine head. Here's the final result of all that work. A lovely out-of-the-box, heavily weathered engine. It may not come through on camera, but it's definitely very eye-catching finish. I began by first adding the main color to the cockpit parts. I started with Vallejo Interior Green and I'm applying that over a black primer to create shadows. Once the paint is dry, which takes about 10 minutes, I will come back in and apply zenith highlights to the main color to create more visual appeal. If you are interested in learning how to do zenith highlights for cockpits, I have a video on my channel about this technique. Here you can see I'm coming in with light coats, building the color up. Make sure to get all the pieces from different angles angles so nothing gets left behind. If you use my thinner mixture, you don't have to worry about the paint covering up the details. The paint will level out to a nice smooth finish. Interesting tidbit about the BearCat I learned this week: one of the members in my local IPMS group, his father actually flew for the French Air Force during the Vietnam era. His father was responsible for delivering the BearCat to the Vietnamese Air Force. I'll talk more about this later in the natural metal portion. After applying the base coat, I'm coming in and performing zenith highlights. Zenith painting techniques are big in the armor modeling world, but not so much in the airplane modeling world. I will freely admit zenith highlighting is not very quote-unquote realistic. However, visually it's very appealing, and that's kind of what I'm going for here. Because the cockpit of the BearCat is so small, you can barely see anything once the canopy is on. So I wanted to make the cockpit pop out a bit. The process of zenith lighting is to create a gradient that is lighter in color at the top of the cockpit and darker at the bottom. It makes it look like the sun has bleached the top portion and the light cannot get deeper into the cockpit, so it gets darker. For any flat panels, you want to start from the middle and then expand outwards as a single light source. I will say that as a kit that's now about 40 years old, plus the price that I purchased the kit for, the cockpit detail is not too shabby. I know there are some inaccuracies in the kit, but nothing that makes it completely unbuildable. Plus, the BearCat is a unique subject that is not really offered by too many modeling companies. Trumpeter / Hobby Boss did put out a 1/48 scale BearCat a few years ago. That kit also has several inaccuracies. From reading on various forums, it seems the Hobbycraft is actually more accurate on shape, with the exception of the engine cowling, than the Trumpeter offering. For the side consoles, I decided to mask them off and airbrush them instead of brush painting. It is more time consuming to do it this way, but the effect is nicer. Time to paint the cockpit dials and switches. My preferred method is to use ammo dial paint to paint World War II cockpits. This paint is specifically formulated for dry brushing. It is pigment heavy and light on the carrier liquid, making it perfect for dry brushing. Here you can see I went in kinda heavy handed, but I'm not worried about it, as I will come back in with a brush moistened with water and clean up the excess dial paint on areas I'm not happy with. Once the painting is done, I always apply a gloss coat to protect my paintwork. This is really important because I'm using acrylics and I plan to use an oil wash. Oil washes can potentially eat away at acrylics. My preferred gloss is Alcalad Aqua Gloss. I am looking for an alternative though, as it is becoming harder and harder to obtain it. For the wash, I used a dark brown oil paint thinned with odorless thinners. Oil washes are great. They give you maximum control, they're subtle, easy to use, easy to clean up, and very versatile. The negative is they take a while to dry. Make sure your oil wash is completely dry before applying a flat coat on top. While I did not show it here, but after the oil was dry, I went back and cleaned up any areas that I was not happy with using odorless thinners. Because I applied the aqua gloss, the odorless thinners will not damage my paintwork. Once the wash is dry and I was happy with the look, it was time to go in and apply the flat coat. I used Vallejo Premium Flat Coat. It is a really nice flat coat, but it's not a dead flat. If you decide to use Vallejo Premium Flat, make sure to give it 24 hours to fully cure or it will be easily damaged. I do not recommend using Vallejo Resin Flat Coat. It's just not good and breaks apart easily. For the last round of weathering on the cockpit, I'm going to use AK Interactive weathering pencils. I picked up the entire range of AK weathering pencils a few months ago and have been testing them on several builds to see what kind of effects I can achieve. AK states they can be used dry or wet over a flat coat. In my testing, I have found they work best when slightly wet. On the main cockpit tub, I applied the AK pencil wet, then blended in everything to create a dusty discoloration effect. For the rear bulkhead, I used the pencil dry to create some chipping. For the dry method, I found the light colors really do not work at all. I will continue to do more testing and see if I can improve my results. Once the pencils are applied, you can spray a flat coat on top to secure the effect in place. However, this will reduce the effect from the pencils by about 30%. This can be a good thing if you want to tone down the weathering from the pencils. I typically don't spray a flat coat on top if I know I'm not going to be handling the model. Lastly, I used an aluminum pencil to create metallic chipping. I will freely admit I did not see any photos of BearCat cockpits with metallic chipping. Filed this under artistic licensing. Finally, I want to introduce you to my new favorite modeling item, UV resin. It is now my preferred way to simulate cockpit glass. Unlike using a gloss to simulate glass on dials, which leaves a 2D effect as it naturally wants to level out, the UV resin creates a 3D effect as it stays in place, thus creating a more realistic glass dial look. Construction of the fuselage is pretty simple and straightforward. It's a two-part fuselage with no real fit issues. The key is to use a lot of glue and clamps to make sure everything fits tightly. One thing to note here is if you use Tamiya glue like I did here, give it a solid day to cure. I have found that the plastic remains very soft for a while if you use Tamiya glue, and if you attempt to scribe over it without the 24-hour wait time, it will leave large holes. Normally, for fuselage construction, I use Testors tube glue with the metal tip applicator. Unfortunately, I have run out of Testors metal tip glue. They only sell the plastic tip applicator glue now, and I don't like that one. I'm looking at testing other glues to find a similar, more gooey type of modeling glue that I can use for fuselage construction. The only other construction on this kit is the wings, which total 3 parts. A large wing bottom section and 2 top wing sections. I did not record the wings being constructed, however they are pretty easy to put together with no major issues. The only problem I found was the wings have incomplete panel lines. I didn't realize that until I'd already sprayed them in the natural metal finish. I wanted to demonstrate a cool trick you can use on your next model. That is how to blend canopy seams when you have no canopy frames. Some canopies have no frames to them. When you glue them in place, there is a seam/step that occurs because of this. You can use UV resin to fill the seam/step. The good thing about UV resin is that it will sand easy and does not fog the canopy. Once the UV resin is dry, you're going to come back in with 400 grit sandpaper and lightly sand the UV resin. Then you're going to come back in with higher grades of sandpaper and start sanding until everything is blended in and it's smooth. Your finger should not be able to feel any of the UV resin as you run it along the seam line of the canopy. The trick to sanding the canopy is to go gently. You do not want to dig into the canopy with the sandpaper. And as you go to higher grits, 1000, 2000 grit, you will notice that the canopy will get foggy, but it will also start getting a little bit more clarity to it. And that's what you're looking for. Once the sanding is done, I came back in with the polishing sponge. A polishing sponge or stick usually has 2 sides. On one side, there's usually a very fine grit, like 5,000, and the polishing side is usually 10,000 grit. This is an important step as it will reduce the remaining haziness by almost 98%. Don't skip this step. We are almost at the home stretch. The polishing stick has pretty much removed all of the sanding marks and haziness to the canopy. Now I will come back in with Tamiya polishing compound to polish out the canopy, get rid of any final marks or haziness, and make the canopy shiny. You don't have to use Tamiya polishing compound. There are other options, but this is what I have in my inventory. I start with Tamiya coarse polishing compound. Using a Q-tip, I rub a small amount on the canopy and keep going until it is completely blended in. Then I will move on to the fine polishing compound, doing the same thing. The key here is to end with Tamiya wax compound. After that, you will have a shiny canopy with no seam lines, no marks, no haziness. If you look at my test piece, I have sprayed one side with AK Extreme Metal Color Aluminum and the other side with Vallejo Metal Colors, and I would bet good money you cannot tell the difference. Now the thing is, I did not use Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum, I used Vallejo Metal Color Chrome. It is, in my opinion, an actual aluminum, while Metal Color Aluminum is a more muted, used aluminum. To obtain the best out of metal colors, you need a gloss primer. Here I am using Vallejo's new gloss black primer. It is definitely a new formula and it works much better than their old gloss black primer. With the old bottle, if you add in my mixed formula, it made the gloss primer go flat. Another thing I wanted to share is this is my second time priming the kit. The first time I primed the kit, there were so many flaws in the surface, highlighted by the primer, that I spent a day just fixing flaws. So I decided to strip the primer away and then sand the surface and reapply the primer. But even after all of that stripping back the primer, sanding the surface, and then reapplying the primer, as you can see, I am still finding flaws and having to sand them out. The flaws on the underside were way worse, and I had to spend a lot of time having to sand out those flaws. When sanding out flaws for a natural metal finish, try to use fine grit sanders so you don't leave any marks. Start with 1000, then 2000, 3000. Once you are finished sanding out the flaws, time to reprime the impacted areas. You want to go slow and steady here, build up the primer, and at the same time check to see if there are any raised areas in your primer. Under a natural metal finish, any raised areas or leftover sanding marks will stand out like a Christmas tree. Finally, we are at my favorite part of the building process, painting the model. The Vallejo Metal Chrome sprays beautifully if you use Tamiya X20A. The X20 makes it dry faster and thus you can handle it and tape over it fairly shortly. I was able to paint the entire model in about 12 minutes, and after waiting 15 minutes, I was able to tape over the chrome with no issues. Go gently. Stay about 5 to 6 centimeters away from the surface and build up the paint. Don't blast it on. It is very thin paint, so be careful. The good thing is that the paint levels out really nicely. I took this model to my local IPMS meeting, and people there could not believe that an acrylic was able to accomplish this brilliance in tone. The chrome really looks exactly like a lacquer paint. On a separate test piece, I sprayed duraluminum, matte aluminum, semi-matte, white aluminum, and regular aluminum to get an idea of how they look on top of the chrome. With the exception of the matte aluminum, which comes off really more as a darkish aluminum color, The rest of the colors look really nice and are fairly subtle. For the front of the engine cowling, I used aluminum. It created a very subtle variation and turned out really nicely. I found out from an IPS member whose father flew for the French Air Force and delivered the BearCats to the South Vietnamese that the BearCats were overpainted lacquer on top of the original sea blue camo, thus giving the BearCats a slightly bluish hue to the metallic paint. The metallic finish is coming along very nicely. I cannot stress how much nicer it looks in person than over the video. For the gun covers, I decided to use aluminum once again. I wanted to keep the gun covers subtle, and the effect was very nice. However, later I decided I wanted to pick out a panel or two on the gun covers and darken the color just to create some variation, and I did that and it looked really nice, and I'm happy I decided to do that. For the flaps, I decided to paint them in semi-matte aluminum. I think this is a really nice color to use to replicate a somewhat used metallic surface. For the underside, I decided to use duraluminum. There's no reason for it, I just wanted a little bit of variation. Prior to applying the decals, I had already added in a coat of intermediate gauzy agent to protect the paintwork. The decals on this kit are really bad. I wish I had bought aftermarket decals because bad decals really stand out on natural metal finish. I really regret using these decals and really wish I had the money to buy aftermarket. One thing to note is how strong the AK Intermediate Gauzy Agent is. Because of how terrible these decals were, I had to use numerous coats of very strong decal setting solution, and it did not ruin the paint or the finish at all. For the weathering, I've decided to use a black oil wash. Because I've already applied the AK Intermediate Gauzy Agent, I'm not worried about the oil wash eating into my acrylic paintwork. Black wash looks really nice on a natural metal finish. If you can, I recommend picking up a long brush like the one I am using to apply the wash. This really helps me apply the wash directly to the panel line and saves a lot of oil paint this way. Once dry, I'm going to use odorless thinners to remove the wash. Again, I'm not worried about the odorless thinners harming my paint because I've already applied a coat of AK Intermediate Gauzy Agent on top. You just gotta give the wash time to dry, and with oils it takes a little bit. Don't rush it. Looking at reference pictures of the South Vietnamese BearCats, I noticed that they have massive exhaust stains and oil leaks. I'm going to create exhaust stains here using thin paint and my airbrush. I really like airbrushing exhaust stains, and if you watch my BF109 video, you can see how to do exhaust stains correctly. Pretty much you use thin paint, start close to the surface and move away, and it will build up this exhaust stain. You want to go slow, you don't want to blast it on.